Hey Geography peeps, I wanted to give you an informative video today. As we look at the coming year and the last bits of units to go over, there's going to be a video I produce every week. One will be like this, where I present kind of like you're seeing the big board, because this is a very visual lesson, and it's something I designed a year or two ago. And the main point behind it was to get you to understand why Russia matters. Why will it matter to you? I know you're a 14 or 15 or even 16-year-old taking this class, and you're even watching this when, you know, there's stuff you could be doing elsewhere. But if there's ever to watch or understand why Russia matters to an American right now, this is what I've designed to show you that. And the way I've done that is by designing a simulation. And so what is a simulation? A simulation is a model that simplifies the complexities of reality. All year long, that's what I've been trying to teach you all to do. The Martian activity was a simulation of trying to get someone to move around on Mars. Obviously, it's oversimplified. There's a lot more to it than just throwing someone on a different planet and telling them to walk around in coordinates. So a lot of the activities I've done have been designed to simplify reality and to create a simulation. Other simulations are games, particularly sports games. Those of you who like to play Madden and manage a team, deciding on who the best wide receiver is for your quarterback and what chemistry they have and whether the plays work with the coach and the style and the system. That's all simulated. You could simulate all you want, and the best teams most likely will win, which then makes it not quite like reality because there's a lot of other factors that don't go into play. So anyway, I designed this simulation to teach you why Russia will matter now and in our future, in our very near future. So this isn't trying to make me be alarmist and, oh my goodness, the sky is falling. I mean, after all, we're in quarantine, but we'll be okay. Russia as a world power will continue to be an issue for most of our lives. And this is going to explain it. So as much as I might sound like I'm saying they're the bad guys, they're not. They're just doing what they need to do in their minds to survive. So here's our simulation. So the first task we do to prepare ourselves for a simulation is we got to get as close to reality as possible. So here, yeah, it's cutting on my hand, it's kind of cool. This is Eurasia. So all the way over here, we got Russia, you know, the Pacific Ocean, we got Europe, we got everything. Basically, I'm covering Russia. So that is all of Russia. And you can see the Himalayas, the mountain ranges at high peaks. You can see these plains that sweep across. You can see deserts there, the oceans, the seas, and all of this up in here too. So you get an idea, okay, Russia's huge, which you should know by now. It's the largest country on Earth. Even though with maps like this, it's actually exaggerating how big Russia is by the way we make maps and distorting them. That's different lesson, different time. Right now, I'm just showing you. This is our first model of Russia. And even this isn't the perfect example. But for what we're doing, we're trying to simplify it. So in this case, this is our map of Russia. And so what I did to simplify this is first, I had to reduce the complexity. And what I did is I turned it into a hex grid map. So here it is. So now it looks really busy. I simulated how the mountains and the hills and the tundra up in the north, the taiga across a line of trees. We got the Gobi Desert here in China and Mongolia. All of these things I simulated with these symbols. Why hexagons? Hexagons are a good boundary and a good way to move around without having diagonal boxes. So there's always stuff that belongs in the box and nothing that's like cut off by corners by how it's designed. So notice though, I changed the terrain. I colored in deserts with these little dots. I did mountains right here, those mountains with the pointies. Then we got grasslands right in here, the taiga, the trees like this. We got rainforests down here. So these are all grasslands right down the middle. So this is to give you an oversimplified view of Eurasia. So far, so good. But now we're going to reduce that complexity that's behind this layer and show you what it is in just black and white. Be prepared. That map gets a little busy too. So this is what we come up with. With all the blanks, that's water. But you have to look very carefully to see, okay, you can start seeing things. But it's still not helpful. No one could go from this and be like, oh, I know exactly what we're talking about. You can see the symbols, and that helps you fill in what's going on. But this doesn't help us enough. So what do we need to add? Well, I'm going to add borders primarily, and I shade in the water, because if I've ever told you to do something in mapping, it's to shade in water first. That makes everything show up a little bit better. So we shaded in the water, added borders, makes this a reasonably useful map. And so as we look on this, this is the map I would have given you had you been in school. If you email me and you really want to do this on your own, go for it. I'll gladly send you copies. But I even had the big paper for you all. I had this was one of the activities I worked really hard on. So whether or not you like it or not, I'm proud of it. And I'll show you why, because this shows exactly what I wanted to teach you about this, why this matters to you. I'm also going quickly because I value your time and I'm trying not to waste your time too much. It's amazing what a little bit of color can do. So here we go. Now we're looking at Eurasia with all the boundaries and borders. And so this gives us a good sense of what we're looking at. So this is the physical map today. And what I want you just to see is to look at boundaries. Because as we look at borders, we look at the things that make borders. Usually it's rivers, mountains, hills, lakes. Natural boundaries generally make borders because they separate and isolate other people and groups and prevent movement. So that's why we have these borders. Now, in this case, though, particularly with Russia, their borders are not the natural borders that they've come to see. They used to be a lot grander, a lot wider borders with more territory in them that was a lot easier to defend. Because we have to think, why are these boundaries so effective? Well, if forests are too dense, you don't have enough area to go through them. You have to cut down trees to get through them. If the areas are too mountainous, like here and along this is Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran. If it's too mountainous, then you only have a few areas to go through, particularly different mountain passes, which are very easy to defend. Deserts, obviously, no one goes across deserts. It's way too expensive. If you have animals in the old days, it would be hard to supply them with enough water and food to cross that land, not to mention the people you're traveling with as well. Modern day times, the heat can get into it. It's still a matter of water and supplies to get through deserts. So deserts become pretty good natural borders over here. Mountains and hills are nasty borders. Forests are generally too difficult, and mountains. So now, if we look at modern Russia and you see these boundaries, you only got a few areas that have good natural boundaries. This taps into Russia's history because they've been invaded. And when they get invaded, lots of bad things happen for the Russian people. So here's your first example. So this is zooming in. Here is present day Moscow right up in here. So we're looking at the Mongol invasions in the 1200s. And you're like, 1200s? Who cares? That's way long time ago. Yes, it was, but it influenced the Russians so much, it created modern day Russia. So this is the Mongol invasion of Europe. We can focus on over here, going into Poland and down in the Carpathians and into the Balkans. But we're not focused on what happens here. We're looking more over here into Russia. And when they came into Russia, yes, they hit all of these cities here. They also completely destroyed this kingdom of Kiev. And the Kievan Rus that used to be the leaders of this land were completely wiped out. So over time, with the Mongols coming in and wiping out these armies, it was Moscow that would collect all the taxes in the areas around and send those taxes to the Mongol Empire. And so if you notice too, the Mongols traveled along this steppe. You see this dotted line here? And so they came in by force through this large flatland because they were all horsemen. They all had horse. The entire Mongol army was on horseback. So this invasion completely changes Russia's political landscape. Political organization, meaning the people and how they've organized themselves into governments. So this greatly changes. That's why you see Russia with the onion domes. Those are very much more tied to the Muslim world and to the East. But because of the Mongol style and whatnot, that was brought in. So that's one reason, one thing that left a mark on Russia. The next major invasion of Russia was done by Napoleon and his army in 1812. Napoleon amassed an army of over 100,000 men, and they traveled through here and invaded and actually conquered Moscow. Now the Russians in Moscow completely abandoned the city. where he takes it in September of 1812. The only thing is the city's burnt to the ground. All the food had been destroyed, and basically the Russians knew that this was getting closer and closer to winter, and the supply lines of Napoleon's army would be too long for them to reach what they needed. So by October, Napoleon abandons Moscow and starts coming back. With his 1 million man army, less than 100,000 make it back to France. And so this was not only a devastating blow to Russia with all of this burning and pillaging and destruction, but also another reminder of the difficulties of invading Russia. So the next major invasion that the Russians worry about comes in 1941. In 1939, Germans and the Russians signed the Nazi-Soviet pact, which said neither one would go to war with one another. And so when Hitler started World War II, and by invading Poland, which is right here, by invading Poland in 1939, the Russians invaded part of Poland and split it between the Germans and the Russians. And then the Germans focused most of their war effort invading France and other places. But by 1941, Hitler goes back on his deal and fully invades in 3 ways into Russia, or the Soviet Union. And so doing causes massive devastation. Civilians are murdered and killed. Populations, the military is completely defeated, and the Germans make it all the way to seeing the spires of Moscow. Before winter sets in, they have to winter camp, and the Russians counterattack during the winter. And so one other thing from all of these, why are we bringing up World War II? Why are we bringing up Napoleon? Well, here's what happened to Russia in the 20th century. So I'm going to start over here first and discuss this, because this is World War I, casualties by country in World War I. And when you think of World War I, you're not thinking that Russia was one of the major combatants, but they were, and they lost big time. It was probably so costly that it did cost the Russian Tsar his throne and his life eventually when the Bolsheviks revolt and take over. So here's one example. World War I, 1.7 million Russians are killed. Over almost 5 million are wounded. So they bared one of the largest brunts of World War I alone. When you see these numbers with France, Austria, Great Britain, and Empire, these are all imperial troops too, which means the French brought in their troops from Africa and Southeast Asia to fight in the trenches. The British brought in India, Pakistan, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. All of their allies came and fought with Great Britain, and they only lost less than 1 million. I mean, I say only, it's still a high casualty rate. But for the understanding here is almost half of what Russia lost. So once again, they're looking at how costly war has been in Europe for the Russians. Now I move over here to World War II losses by country. And if you see the number of people killed in the Soviet Union, it's insanely high. Almost 25 million people are estimated to have been killed by World War II. Not all of them, in fact, most of them are civilian casualties done by the Germans in the starvation and a lot of the refugees fleeing. A lot of the destruction was on civilians, not military casualties. You see this other part is as percentage of the population. So how much the population was lost. You see how devastating Poland lost and the Germans as well. But when you look at numbers, Russia still paid one of the highest prices of any combatant during World War II. So you're looking at invasions and wars cost Russia lots. So let's look at then what their old empire looked like. So the Soviets in red, these are countries that were part of the Soviet Union prior to its fall in 1991. And if you look at their boundaries, you have mountains in the south that clearly delineate the Soviet Union border. You have mountains and desert, plus China being an ally in terms of communism, they weren't much of a threat. And then you have over here in Europe, where you have just a little bit of grassland in Ukraine, and then you have trees and mountains that really make it difficult for an invasion. So the Soviet Union, worried about invasion by particularly the Germans, very much protected and insulated themselves from any future invasion by doing this. The only problem, though, is they don't last forever. Communism doesn't work. And the whole problem with their communism is it collapses in 1991. So let's bring us back to today's map. So looking at the countries lost, they now have lost this natural boundary here with mountains. They've lost this natural boundary here with mountains.
They've lost this mountainous and narrow area, and now this is the Russian border. And if you see that, instead of it 500 miles of open land for invasion, it's now about 2,000 miles of open land from invasion from Europe. And so that gets into the Russian mentality of feeling exposed. If you're exposed and you're vulnerable, you're going to worry about what happens to you. And they're still doing that today. Now, Russia didn't live in a world all by themselves. There were other actors that were fighting against them. During the Cold War, their biggest nemesis, their enemy, was us, the United States. And we knew geopolitics too, and we knew what to do to solve this problem as well. And one of the things we did was made sure we could respond to Russia anywhere they threatened. So here's what US bases, and current US bases even today. These countries in red are all countries that have supported us in wartime or are major allies even today. So you have Japan and South Korea over here. Since World War II, they've been allies, particularly South Korea during the Korean War became our allies too. We still have bases there. We still have troops there. So we have over here, then you look at Central Asia. Because of the war in Afghanistan, we have Afghanistan that now has bases. We also have two other countries that were right next to Afghanistan, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, that have also supported and helped us. Both India and Pakistan have been nominative allies with us as well, but they've also supported us, particularly in the war on terror. Then we get into the Middle East. We have Iraq it's getting iffier now, but Iraq has military bases in the United States. Saudi Arabia has troops in it, and that's one of the reasons behind 9/11, not what we're talking about right now. And then we have Egypt and Turkey that are also allies. We give money to these allies so they support us. They don't want our money or our gravy train going away. So we give them money, they support us, and look at our map. Then we come back over here. Poland's been a staunch ally with us ever since the fall of the Cold War. And we have bases in Germany as well as in Italy. So if you look at this map now, you look at the countries involved, you're going to see that really only China and the Soviet Union, Russia today, doesn't really get along with China in so much the same way anymore. They kind of had a falling out in the late 50s between the two countries, even a small war. Now they're kind of cool, but they're still distant and not considered allies or friends. They're just, kind of like, look, you stay over there, I stay over there. We'll not bother one another. And that's kind of how they're going. So when you look at Russia, this country right here, and you're looking at all the places the United States have bases, you're looking hemmed in. And if you've ever felt where you're trapped, or you're hemmed in, or you're blocked, you start to get scared and fearful. And if that's the case, you start to react. You start to do things to make sure you can't be exposed or invaded. So what does Russia do? As we have all these allies, they've made sure they're on good relationships with all the countries next to them, particularly the ones that used to be the Soviet Union. They still give aid and support and money to these countries, so they'll stay supportive. And that's what gets us into why this is dangerous. This country right here, Ukraine, we're going to zoom in on that right now. All right, so we super zoom in on this little map of Europe, okay? So this is modern day Ukraine. And the Ukraine government has looked towards Europe and Russia for help, for trade, for assistance. The problem has been about 5 or 6 years ago, the people in Ukraine have rejected most of the leadership of Russia. They don't want Russia involved in their politics like they've used to be. And they elected someone who's going to try to change, be more European, and be more swayed by the Western European standards. The problem is Russia doesn't want Ukraine to fall that way. They don't want that exposure. They don't want to feel vulnerable to having a non-ally right next to them. So what do? They cause some resentment, particularly right in this hexagon right here. And they cause separatists to demand an independence and fight against Ukraine. And then right here on this map is the Crimean Peninsula. The Russian military seizes that peninsula for themselves. Now, one side note to all of Russia's, most of the ports that they have, particularly up here and way out in the west, those freeze during the winter. And knowing that, fleets are the way to trade. If you have access to ocean, you need to be able to trade.
And having frozen ports means you can't trade. Russia's always worried about having a port with warm water so it doesn't freeze. Right here has always had a Russian naval base, and they've allowed it because they wanted to have some port that Russia could have access to the ocean and sea that wouldn't freeze. But their threat of losing the support in Ukraine causes them, one, they tried to assassinate the Ukrainian president with a really nasty poison, like it ruined his face. They finally, he survived, but you look it up, Ukrainian prime minister poison attack or whatever, and you'll find it. And so there's conflict here. A quick little video to show you some of what I'm talking about. Boom.
To what America is officially calling a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russian troops spreading out throughout the strategic Crimean Peninsula. President Obama speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin, apparently pulling no punches, although it is unclear what the White House can really do about all of this. So let's go straight to ABC's Alex Marquardt, who's on the ground in Crimea. Alex, good morning to you.
Good morning, Dan. The pressure from Russia is growing. Large groups of pro-Russia troops surrounding Ukrainian bases, ordering their forces off of them so they can occupy them. The international warning to Russia to end its invasion is being ignored. This morning, more unidentified pro-Russia armed militias controlling the streets of Crimea's capital. These troops are standing guard just a few hundred feet away from a Ukrainian naval base. They have twice asked the base command to surrender. So far, they have refused. This is a Russian invasion, the U.S. says. It has no doubt these are Russian forces and has demanded their immediate withdrawal.
The Russian military must stand down. The aspirations of the Ukrainian people must be respected, and political dialogue must be allowed to continue.
Putin told Obama that Russia has the right to defend its interests and people in Ukraine. Russia! We've seen it for ourselves. This column of armored personnel carriers roaming the roads here in Ukraine's Crimea, where most people are Russian, while these shadowy pro-Russian forces here violently took over government facilities. It has fueled civilian unrest across eastern Ukraine. In one city, pro-Russia demonstrators rampaged through City Hall and brutally beat those who oppose them. There is a growing international chorus slamming Russia's actions. The British Prime Minister saying there is no excuse. Canada withdrawing its ambassador from Moscow. But many here are hoping Russia will go further.
Okay, so the second major issue, then we get down here, and I'm going to switch maps for this one. Okay, we're taking the long approach, right? Ha ha ha, I know, you missed the jokes, don't you? No, you don't. All right, so we go down here to the Middle East. It doesn't notice, there we go, Middle East, la 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 la. So here, there's a country feuding, so here, there's a country in the midst of a civil war still, Syria. And Syria's had some problems with the Kurds that are in northern Iraq and eastern Turkey and northern Syria. And they've been the strong allies to the United States. We've been supplying the Kurds because we supported them against Saddam for a while, and we're supporting them here to get rid of the regime. However, Russia's made deals with that regime, with Assad, the government that they're revolting against. And their deal involves, guess what? A warm water port right on the Mediterranean. So Russia has been supporting Syria in the midst of the civil war. And this guy's pretty bad. I mean, people protested. So what did he do when the people were protesting? He rolled out tanks and shot them all. So then a civil war ensued where the military started to defect and units started switching sides, and it got really nasty. And that's when ISIS comes in, because ISIS existed when there wasn't anyone really controlling this area. They're pretty much gone by now, by the way. The next thing, though, is in battling ISIS, we supported the Kurds. But Turks hated the Kurds because the Kurds tried to get independence in Turkey. So you have over here, and you have all U.S. ally, mind you, and the Russians and Turks never really got along historically either. And so the Russians scoot by Turkish airspace, and the Turks shoot a Russian airplane down. And that big concern for us is one of our allies just shot down a Russian plane. That's an act of war with Russia. So luckily that kind of eased down and came down a bit, but that was a big concern. But once again, warfare, conflict, Russia, warm water ports, all this stuff is showing up once again.
One of the other issues for Russia, though, is right here. This is the Caspian Sea, and there's a lot of oil around it, and I'll show you later as well. But the oil around here, and the problem is for Russia is they are expecting that oil to come up into Russia before they ship it out to other places. Why? Because their oil is their gravy chain into Europe. They supply a lot of heating for parts of countries in Europe. Like Germany, 50% of Germany's natural gas comes from Russia. So Russia knows, you better treat us nicely or we turn off the tap and you don't get heating. And if you don't know anything about this, Germany can get quite cold. So that's another way Russia's worried, because some of these countries are getting more and more friendly with countries that are not friendly to Russia or with us. And they're looking at putting pipelines that go, say, through Turkey, which the Russians do not get along with. Not to mention they've been our ally for so long. So that's one other way where geography and resources and politics is all coming together to create these problems. So then that gets into one thing that I'm skirting a line, because I'm only going to be talking about what most people can agree on within our own government. I'm not getting into the political side. I'm not touching impeachment with a 10-foot pole. But from documents from our own government, we have evidence that Russia did meddle in elections, whether influencing people, whether producing fake news or fake ads or fake support, whatever. Russia got into our elections. I'm not getting into how much or with who, any of that stuff. But we know they were interfering. And why were they interfering? Because Barack Obama over here was supporting Ukraine's defense of its own land. And so they did not want another person supporting this foreign policy, not to mention the stance against the Kurds in Syria. Those were two things that the Obama administration was doing. And they thought by influencing the election, they might get results more favorable to them. I am not commenting on the Trump administration's dealing with these issues. However, I will say we did leave the Kurds. We have left Syria, or at least most of our fighting force has left Syria since Trump came in power. And with the country of Ukraine, we haven't had much in terms of supporting them against the Russian separatists here and Russia here. So those were two actions that influence us. So this whole thing started with, well, Mr. Johnson, how does this affect me, or how should I care? Well, first off, Russia is acting hemmed in. They're worried about being isolated and invaded and cut off. We've done enough to make sure every one of their borders, we have an ally nearby that we could use if we ever had to go to war. Secondly, as they meddle, they can influence our economy, whether it be with oil prices here or threats of conflict and trade with these countries in Europe, or just flat out war. If you're pushed into if you're backed into a corner, one of the things you're going to do is worry what happens to you next, and making sure that you cannot be put into such a position. And so when that happens, you'll act any which way you can to survive. And that's why Russia can be dangerous. Not to mention they have a political leader who's been in power for at least 10 years, if not 15. And that's dangerous too. Having a long-term leader like that starts turning much more like a dictatorship than it does as a presidency. And when he can do what he wants, get rid of people who disagree with him, this becomes another concern for us. And so all in all, why you should matter about Russia is just understanding what they could possibly do. I'm not saying they're going to do these things, but this is their mentality. And part of this as a job, as a career in terms of geography, is looking at how geography and resources and trade and politics and history all come together to define Russia, its boundaries, its borders, its problems, and also predict what it might do next. So for you all, they could be a threat to the United States. That's it. That's the simplest point. Whether it be an economy issue, whether it be an economic issue, like right now, we're going through the coronavirus and this quarantine, which will have impact on our economy. If we have to sustain an economy that has this, if we have to go through another hit to our economy, that too will affect jobs, will affect money, will affect how much things cost and prices. And that's where it'll hit you no matter what you're thinking or where you know they are. So thank you for watching all of this. I hope you got enough of these questions right, and good luck.